For the second video for Black History Month, I decided to go with the life of Frederick Douglass. So that's going to start right now. Thanks for watching.
Hello, I'm Joe Collymore, and February, as you know, is Black History Month. It's a time where we gather to remember those historic figures who advanced the quality of life for not only Black Americans, but all citizens living here in the United States. Among those individuals was an American social reformer, abolitionist, orator, writer, and statesman named Frederick Douglass. Douglass is known to have spoken in Hingham on occasion, one instance being at the Old Ship Church right here, as well as another during an anti-slavery rally in 1844 at the First Baptist Church, also right here in town. But let's go back even further to understand events that shaped the man Frederick Douglass would become. Frederick Douglass was born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. He was born into slavery on the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay in Talbot County, Maryland. While the exact date of his birth is unknown, he would later choose to celebrate his birthday on February 14th. Douglass was of mixed race, which likely included Native American and African on his mother's side, as well as European. Frederick would come to be separated from his mother. He would later write, "The opinion was whispered that my master was my father, but of the correctness of this opinion I know nothing. My mother and I were separated when I was but an infant. It was common custom in that part of Maryland from which I ran away to part their children from their mothers at a very early age. I do not recollect ever seeing my mother by the light of day. She would lie down with me and get me to sleep, but long before I waked, she was gone." As a result of this separation, Douglass would come to live with his maternal grandmother, Betty Bailey, who would also be separated from him at the age of 6 and sent to the Y House plantation. When the owner there died, Douglass would be given to Lucretia Auld, wife of Thomas Auld, who sent him to serve his brother Hugh Auld in Baltimore. In Douglass's biography, he would mention how lucky he felt to be in the city, where he said slaves were almost free men compared to those on plantations. When Douglass was about 12, Hugh Auld's wife, Sophia, would start to teach him the alphabet. Hugh Auld disapproved of the tutoring and asserted that literacy would encourage slaves to desire freedom. Sophia would come to adopt this belief as well, and one day refrain from both teaching and allowing reading materials for Douglass. However, Douglass would continue to learn to read from white children in the neighborhood and by observing the writings of the men with whom he worked. As Douglass began to read newspapers, pamphlets and political materials, and books of every description, he would be led to question and condemn the institution of slavery. Following his stay with the Aulds, Douglass would be hired out to a William Freeland for some time, during which he would teach other slaves on the plantation to read the New Testament at a weekly Sunday school. As word spread of his activities, the interest among slaves in learning to read was so great that in any given week, more than 40 slaves would attend these lessons. For about 6 months, their study would go relatively unnoticed. And while Freeland remained complacent about their activities, other plantation owners became incensed about their slaves being educated. One Sunday, they actually burst in on the gathering, armed with clubs and stones to disperse the congregation permanently. In 1833, Thomas Auld took Douglass back from Hugh, and he would send Douglass to work for Edward Covey, a poor farmer who had a reputation as a slave breaker. He whipped Douglass regularly and nearly broke him psychologically. At 16 years old, Douglass would finally rebel against these beatings and fight back. After Douglass won a physical confrontation, Covey never tried to beat him again. Following, Fredrick would try to escape the plantation many times. In 1837, Douglas would meet and fall in love with Anna Murray, a free black woman in Baltimore about 5 years older than he. Her free status strengthened his belief in the possibility of gaining his own freedom. Murray encouraged him and supported his efforts by aid and money. And on September 3, 1838, after many attempts to escape his situation, Douglas successfully found his way out by boarding a train from the newly merged Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore Railroad to the great northern cities. He reached Havre de Grace, Maryland, and Harford County in the northeast corner of the state along the southwest shore of the Susquehanna River, which then flowed into the Chesapeake Bay. Although this placed him some 20 miles from the free state of Pennsylvania, it was easier to travel through Delaware, another slave state. Dressed in a sailor's uniform provided to him by Murray, who also gave him part of her savings to cover his travel costs, he carried identification papers and protection papers that he had obtained from a free black seaman. Douglas crossed the wide Susquehanna River by the railroad steam ferry at Havre de Grace to Perryville on the opposite shore in Cecil County, then continued by train across the state line to Wilmington, Delaware, a large port at the head of the Delaware Bay. Because the rail line was not yet completed, he would then travel by steamboat along the Delaware River, further northeast to the Quaker city of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, an anti-slavery stronghold. He continued to the safe house of the noted abolitionist David Ruggles in New York City. His entire journey to freedom took less than 24 hours. He said of his arrival, "I've often been asked how I felt when I first found myself on free soil, and my readers may share the same curiosity. There is scarcely anything in my experience about which I could not give a more satisfactory answer. A new world had opened upon me. If life is more than breath and the quick round of blood, I've lived more in one day than in a year of my slave life. It was a time of joyous excitement, which words can barely tamely describe. But in a letter written to a friend soon after reaching New York, I said, I felt as one might feel upon escape from a den of hungry lions. Anguish and grief, like darkness and rain, may be depicted, but gladness and joy, like the rainbow, defy the skill of pen or pencil." Once Douglas had arrived, he sent for Murray to follow him north to New York. She brought with her the necessary basics for them to set up a home, and they were married on September 15, 1838, by a black Presbyterian minister just 11 days after Douglas had reached New York. They adopted Johnson as their married name to divert attention. The couple settled in New Bedford, Massachusetts in 1838, and due to his experience working as a ship's caulker in the port city of Baltimore, he was able to get work there in New Bedford in that same capacity, later moving to Lynn, Massachusetts in 1841. Meeting and staying with the couple Nathan and Mary Johnson in New Bedford, they adopted Douglas as their married name. And in New Bedford, Johnson was such a common name that he wanted one that was more distinctive and asked Nathan to choose a suitable surname. Nathan Johnson had been reading the poem The Lady of the Lake, where two of the principal characters in Walter Scott's poem have the surname Douglas, and he suggested that name for him. Douglas thought of joining a white Methodist church, but from the beginning he was disappointed when he saw it was segregated. Later, he joined the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, an independent black denomination first established in New York City, which counted among its members Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman. He then became a licensed preacher in 1839, and this helped him hone his oratorical skills. He held various positions, including steward, Sunday school superintendent, and sexton. And in 1840, Douglas delivered a speech in Elmira, New York, then a station on the Underground Railroad, and years later it became a black congregation that would become the region's largest church. Douglas also joined several organizations in New Bedford and regularly attended abolitionist meetings. He subscribed to William Lloyd Garrison's weekly journal, The Liberator. Inspired by Garrison, Douglas later said, "No face and form ever impressed me with such sentiments of the hatred of slavery as did those of William Lloyd Garrison." So deep was this influence that in his last biography, Douglas confessed, "His paper took a place in my heart second only to the Bible." Garrison was likewise impressed with Douglas and had written about his anti-colonialism stance in The Liberator as early as 1839. And in 1841, Douglas first heard Garrison speak at a meeting of the Bristol Anti-Slavery Society. And at another meeting, Douglas was unexpectedly invited to speak. After telling his story, Douglas was encouraged to become an anti-slavery lecturer. A few days later, Douglas spoke at the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society's annual convention in Nantucket. At 23 years old, Douglas conquered his nervousness and gave an eloquent speech about his rough life as a slave. However, Douglas would continue to face difficulties even as a free man. While living in Lynn, Douglas would engage in early protest against the segregation present in the transportation system there, where he himself had experienced the ills of during an incident at the Lynn Central Square station, where Douglas was thrown off an Eastern Railroad train because he refused to sit in the segregated railroad coach. In 1843, Douglas joined other speakers in the American Anti-Slavery Society's 100 Conventions Project, a 6-month tour at meeting halls throughout Eastern and Midwestern United States. During this tour, slavery supporters frequently accosted Douglas. And at a lecture in Pendleton, Indiana, an angry mob chased and beat Douglas before a local Quaker family, the Hardys, rescued him. His hand was broken in the attack. It healed improperly and bothered him for the rest of his life. He would then go to Europe to avoid his captors and experience a life as a freeman. 11 days and a half gone, and I have crossed 3,000 miles of the perilous deep. Instead of a democratic government, I am under a monarchical government. Instead of the bright blue sky of America, I am covered with the soft gray fog of the Emerald Isle. I breathe, and lo, the chattel becomes a man. I gaze around in vain for one who will question my equal humanity, claim me as his slave, or offer me an insult. I employ a cab. I am seated beside white people. I reach the hotel. I enter the same door. I'm shown into the same parlor. I dine at the same table. And no one is offended. I find myself regarded and treated at every turn with the kindness and deference paid to white people. Douglas would come to build relations with Europeans and be influenced by their ways. He became one of the most famous intellectuals of his time, advising presidents and lecturing to thousands on a range of causes, including women's rights and Irish home rule. Although this is only a look at the beginning of Douglas's life, Douglas would lead a very prolific life in politics and advocacy for the rights of free slaves. Among his many accomplishments would be recruiting soldiers for the Civil War, serving under 5 presidents, writing a very successful autobiography titled Narrative of the Life of Fredrick Douglass, an American slave in 1845, which within 3 years would be reprinted 9 times with 11,000 copies circulating in the United States. He also established an anti-slavery newspaper. I'd like to introduce Martha Buick, an active member of the Hingham's Historical Society. She's quite knowledgeable about the life and times of Fredrick Douglass and other abolitionists of the time. She's written a book, Tranquility Grove, the Abolitionist Picnic of 1844, and she can speak to Douglass as an abolitionist in his times in Hingham and the South Shore. Hi, Martha, and welcome.
Hi. Well, thanks so much for inviting me, Joe. I enjoyed your presentation very, very much.
This is quite an interesting book. I've had a chance to at least read excerpts of it, and I'm looking forward to really going through this in depth. What I'd really like to know is what prompted you to write this book?
Well, it's actually a project of the Hingham Historical Commission, the town's historical commission. And the town historian, Alexander Macmillan, was aware of the fact of this particular abolitionist picnic, which was supposed to be the largest of its kind ever held. Mm-hmm. And it took place on a piece of property that's actually still owned by the town, a 24-acre plot that's all tangled and brushy and overgrown, and is located between Central Street and Hersey Street, now called Burns Memorial Park. And so he thought that if we had a chance to find out more about the history of this day, which people had sort of forgotten about over the century, and well, it's now 175 years, but if we found out more about it, that this might then interest the town in bringing the property back, possibly having some educational materials related to it, and giving us an opportunity to use the site to learn about the passions and the issues of that time.
Tell me a little bit about the cover.
Yes, the cover has a wonderful collage, which is actually owned by the Art Institute of Chicago. Oh. And it is a collage that was created by a woman about 20 years old from Weymouth. Her name was Susan Torrey Merritt. And it was just perfect for this small book because it shows an abolitionist or an anti-slavery picnic or rally of some kind that took place in Weymouth, probably in the 1840s. We're not sure quite what year. But the only difference between that and Hingham is, of course, the location. Yes. And the fact that Hingham had another 9,500 people attending. But if you look at this picture of this cover, you'll notice that there are people are in fairly formal attire. There are both black and white participants, all dressed in the Sunday best. And there are the banners of the United States and the Liberty Party, which was one of the parties, anti-slavery party at that time. So it seemed to be a perfect cover, and the publisher thought so as well, fortunately.
What was your experience like as you went about gathering information to pull this book together, and some of the factual pieces that you've actually included here?
Well, when I began, Alec Macmillan gave me a pile of deeds, and he thought this was going to be a Registry of Deeds project. And sure enough, I went down to the registry in Plymouth and tried to find out what I could about the ownership of the property, because that's an element of this, and what had the property been before. And you can actually trace the divisions back to the founding of Hingham in 1635, and then trace the ownership up until today. But what happened is that I started to use Google and look at history books and try to find out more about this event, this big abolitionist picnic. And everything I saw made me think, oh my gosh, look who is here. This is, my goodness, look at this. I mean, for instance, John Quincy Adams, having been president, was still the congressman for this area. He wrote an impassioned, long letter that sort of set the stage for the day when all these people came and convened in Hingham. Even learning about why they had a picnic on the 1st of August in 1844, what that was about, that Fredrick Douglass was here. I thought, oh my goodness. Now, even though his words weren't recorded from that day, there was record in various memoirs and so forth of his having been here. There were songs. The songbook of the anti-slavery songbook was created and collected by Jairus Lincoln from Hingham. The reason that this big abolitionist picnic met in Hingham was because of a Hingham son by the name of Sidney Howard Gay. And one of the Ebenezer Gay families. They're very famous among the founders and religious fathers of Hingham and Old Ship Church. But he was working with Garrison and had just taken over the editorship of the sort of the New York counterpart to Garrison's Liberator. He was the editor of the National Slavery Standard down in New York. And he grew up near Tranquility Grove and said that would be a great location for a picnic. And so The picnic was planned as part of a number of events to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the liberation of slaves by the British Empire in the Caribbean of the West Indies. And so to the people who were abolitionists of the day,
Yes.
the celebration of the liberation of the slaves in the West Indies was far more important to them than the 4th of July.
Yes.
This was their life and this was their passion.
That's quite interesting. We were sharing earlier about what Douglass had written and shared in a speech that he gave about the 4th of July.
That's right.
In Rochester, New York in 1852. If I could read from that.
Mm-hmm.
What to the American slave is your 4th of July? To him, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless, your denunciations of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence, your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy. A thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour. That was written by Frederick Douglass in 1852 about how we celebrate the 4th of July. I mean, how was that received? How do you think that that was received in Rochester, New York at that time?
Well, I think by the abolitionists, they would agree. Of course, by those who were not, they would not agree. And I'm not sure, because I'm not a Douglass scholar, but I know that at the beginning of his involvement with the abolitionists, that he joined Garrison in being opposed to the Constitution because he felt that it didn't have room for the slave or the equality. But later he was influenced by other philosophers, and he felt, and apparently changed his mind, and felt that the Constitution had the potential of providing equality. I don't know what the turning point was for him, and I don't know when 52, where that was along the period of his growth and change. But I can just imagine the electricity that people must have felt when they heard those words from this very compelling speaker.
I wonder what he would have thought of Colin Kaepernick in today's contemporary times of taking a knee.
I think he'd be taking a knee right there with him too, yes. Well,
Indeed.
I mean, by comparison, taking a knee seems mild when you
Yes.
think of the words that were used. And in fact, what I've included in the book, or the book includes some excerpts of abolitionist songs. And what would happen is in these songbooks, they would take familiar tunes like Auld Lang Syne and put radical inflammatory words to them, or My Country 'Tis of Thee, or hymns. And some of the great poets of the day, like John Greenleaf Whittier, Garrison himself, and others, would write these fulminating songs, and everybody would be waving their fists and singing loudly. The whole, I mean, they were passionate. They were passionate about this. And when you think about the issue, they had every right to be, truly. But I will say, I mean, when you ask about the process of discovery,
Yes.
among the exciting discoveries were the records, the newspaper articles that you can find in the library or historical societies, if you look on the microfilm, that had the accounts of the day. In 175 years ago, everything was mentioned in great detail. So in fact, if you look back to the newspapers that reported on this event, they had the detail of how people arrived, where they came from, where their horses were kept, who would take care of the horses while they walked up to Fountain Square near the Lincoln statue here in Hingham, where they started the procession, where they then walked down to Steamboat Wharf, where the delegates from Essex, Middlesex, and Suffolk County arrived by steamboat from Liberty Wharf in Boston, Liverpool Wharf in Boston. They then had a procession led by young women in white, where they're wearing great wreaths of oak leaves. And it described every single delegation, the banners that they carried, the individuals leading the processions. So the whole script is right there in the newspapers of 175 years ago. They then walked from the steamboat wharf along the harbor, then down North Street, went down that little South Street extension, turned left on Main Street. They all processed up Main Street, and then they turned between the houses at Main Street, 137, 135, two houses owned by the Thaxter brothers, and they were the ones that owned Tranquility Grove. So all these thousands of people went up and over the hill and down into the grove. And then there was described all the letters and that were read, and the speakers who spoke, and the singers who were there, and the food that had been gathered to serve all these thousands of people. It's all there.
It's amazing when you think about the number of people that gathered at that time. A little over 10,000, would you say? Roughly?
Well, they would say, you've heard reports everything from 6 to 10, 8,
Okay.
who knows. So,
But still a fairly
big
large
group.
turnout during that time.
yes.
To, of all things, to gather and celebrate this movement, this social movement
Yes.
of abolishing slavery.
Yes. And there were other celebrations for that 10th anniversary year as well, that were encouraged by the Garrison group in Boston. The day before, which was August 1st itself, actually this was held on August 2nd because it had rained on the 1st. But on August 1st, there had been a gathering in Concord, and Douglass was there as well. But the big speaker of the day was Ralph Waldo Emerson, and he gave a speech that I included in the back of this book.
Yes.
That's quite long, but it is extraordinary because it includes the story of the emancipation, the Parliament actions in Britain, the horrors of slavery. It really is an incredible document. But he spoke, and that speech is the one thing that's really been remembered from that day. But meanwhile, there was also a 10th anniversary celebration by the colored citizens of Boston, as they called it. And there was a description of their procession and gathering at the Tremont Temple. Maybe it's the same one that's there today, I'm not sure. And then the fourth one was a gathering of the mostly black citizens of New Bedford. So there was a whole procession there. So there was all of this network of celebration.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
And within Hingham itself, and we talk about First Baptist Church, played a very key role, I think, during Frederick Douglass's appearances here in Hingham along with Old Ship.
Yes, apparently Douglass was first welcomed by the First Baptist Church when he was here a couple of years before. So he made several trips there. But the leading church, I suppose you'd say, for this event was what was called the Third Congregational, now we know as New North.
Okay.
And there was the pastor there was Reverend Oliver Stearns. And when he arrived, he was an abolitionist. So he was very, very key to the Hingham anti-abolitionist activity from early on. And in fact, at the time of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, he delivered a homily that was so powerful that his congregation had it reprinted and it went around the country. So Stearns was very much part of this abolitionist day too.
Are there other tidbits in this book that I find quite interesting? For example, Lucretia Leonard that you chose to include in here. Tell me the story about Lucretia Leonard.
Yes, she is somebody I'd heard about for a long time. She was in service to the Thaxter sisters. She was their servant, and there were the three, Anna, Eliza, and I'm not sure, Catherine, perhaps the other. And the Thaxter sisters were very active abolitionists and very much involved with the anti-slavery fairs and activities, and they were key organizing people for the event this day. And so I believe that Lucretia Leonard would have been intimately involved as well because she was so much involved with their lives and activities. But how she's known in Hingham was that she was the only, there were slave galleries, so-called, in New North Church, then the Third Congregational Church. And she was the only person sitting up there by herself, even though she was not a slave and she was a black servant. And when the Plymouth Anti-Slavery Society voted to end segregation, she was invited down to join the Thaxter sisters in their pew at New North Church, and she sat there with them for the rest of her life. And after they passed away, she continued to be welcomed and sat there with the congregation until she passed away in 1904. And she's buried next to the Thaxter sisters up in the Hingham Cemetery behind Old Ship Church. But this is a wonderful picture of her in the book that was taken towards the end of her life. But the story is that her mother was probably of a Wampanoag black background, and her mother was Leonard, and then married another gentleman down around Scituate. And when he passed away, she married James Tuttle, for whom I believe Tuttleville was named. I think he helped to form the neighborhood up at around Ward Street in Hingham.
Yes, very rich history.
Yeah, so she'd be a stepdaughter of Tuttle.
Yes. Other Hingham abolitionists that you touched base about, you referenced Howard Gay and the Gay home, the Sidney Howard Gay home on South Street. There are other notables in here as well. Can you share a little bit more about, for example, Samuel Joseph May?
Yes, that's very interesting. Samuel Joseph May was the brother of Abigail May, and Abigail May married Bronson Alcott, and they're the parents of Louisa May Alcott. When Abigail and Bronson were courting, she was here in Hingham, walking through Tranquility Grove in the evenings, the same property.
Yes.
But at that time, it was a place for wandering and for poetic evenings and for church picnics, and then for gatherings like this as well. So there's another side of Tranquility Grove, and I included her and Bronson Alcott because they wrote poems about that experience in that event. But her brother, Samuel Joseph May, was down connected with the South Scituate parish, and became a very strong abolitionist, and was kicked out of his parish because of that, and eventually ended up in the Syracuse area. But he was a key organizer with the Garrisonians. They were sort of called the Boston clique. And so he carried his abolitionism, and he became a part of the Underground Railroad as well. So he's a very powerful figure, and his archives have become an important abolitionist scholarly center. And if you look his name up today, you can find a lot of correspondence and books and important materials.
I find this fascinating, and I really want to thank you for coming out to sit with me and just to really bring this book to life, and to bring to life in a more relevant way the work of Frederick Douglass, and particularly as he connects here in the town of Hingham. You know, growing up here on the South Shore, and some of our early history lessons, particularly around the early formation of this nation, this Commonwealth, from the early colonials, the landing of the Pilgrims, all the way up through all of the great wars. There are little bits and pieces of Black American history, if you will. And Frederick Douglass was just sort of like almost a little bit of a footnote. It would be great, particularly here in Hingham, if some of his work and his presence in this community could have a little bit more than a paragraph in our history books today. That would be pretty cool.
I agree with you. And Douglass, as well as those who were abolitionists and those who had key roles to play along the way, there were, for instance, Chief Justice Cushing, who was involved with writing the court decision that ended slavery as such in Massachusetts, and he was descended from the Cushings of Hingham. So a combination of Douglass's life and the others would certainly be wonderful to learn more about. But thank you so much.
Well, I look forward to hearing more about your book. And this is Joe Collymore. Thank you for listening in. And we thank our guest, Martha Buick.
Thanks so much. It's been wonderful.